everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. When I began this podcast, I didn't know too much about the key shows at the end of 1.0. The years 1999 and 2000 weren't exactly lost to me, but it was harder then than it is now to get the most recent recordings. And even if you were lucky enough to get a recording of a recent show at the end of the century or the beginning of the new one, chances are that the recording didn't quite capture the intricacies and the details that you would need to hear in order to appreciate what the band was playing at the time. That's kind of a long-winded way to say that today's guest, Will Little, shines a ton of light on the technical aspects of what Phish was up to, musically speaking, during the summer 2000 tour. Will chose to discuss his memories of July 4th, 2000, when Phish played the second of two nights at Camden. While many guests on Attendance Bias, and I'm guilty of this as well, focus on the fan perspective of their chosen show, Will focuses mostly on what made the soundscapes and the atmospheric playing of 2000 so interesting and compelling. For years, I've known that the soundboard recordings of this tour were high-level, dense stuff, but I never had the vocabulary to explain why I felt this way. I still don't have the vocabulary, but luckily, we have Will here to help us out today. And boy, did he pick the right show. July 4th, 2000 encapsulates the 2000 sound, as well as any other show that year. In fact, the second set is a legendary 5-song second set that opens with a 30-minute Gotta Jaboo. If you're the type of fan who likes to press play, lay back, listen, and then wonder, how are they doing this? Then this is your show, and this is your episode. If you haven't figured it out by now, Will is a multi-instrumentalist from the Southeast who is typically involved in a number of projects, including longtime Asheville-based band East Coast Dirt, and by the time this episode airs, he'll be a part of the Phish tribute band Nectar, A Picture of Phish. He'll give more details about those projects once the conversation starts. So let's get it going. Let's join Will to chat about the nuance of specialized guitar effects, what the funk siren really is, and whether or not Backwards Down the Number Line is a great Phish song, as we break down July 4th, 2000 in Camden. Will, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you?
Doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Just got some good news, so I'm flying pretty high, and I'm excited to talk about the show that you picked for today, which is July 4th at Camden. I was really excited that you chose this show because so we talked a little bit about this off mic. I think, and I'll have to do a fact check on this, the first 10 shows or the first 7 shows of July 2000, I think this is the missing puzzle piece. I think you've solved the riddle that every show in this first week of July 2000 has been covered on this podcast, and now you've plugged it in with July 4th.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that when I picked it out. My first show would have been my first choice, but you had already covered that one, and that was 12/11/99.
So before we get into Phish or anything like that, Will, you are a musician, a talented musician. I've seen you play live on keyboards, but you're not limited to being a keyboard player. For the audience's edification, can you tell us a little bit about bands you've played with, how you play, what instruments you play? Give us a little bit of background about yourself as a musician.
Okay, yeah. I started playing guitar in high school, mid-90s, early 90s, Nirvana times. Big into that whole alternative rock scene when I first started playing, and then discovered Phish shortly after that. So played guitar through the 90s, early 2000s is when I started playing a little bit of keyboards and mandolin. So those would be the 3 instruments that I'm proficient with. Mandolin pretty much just at a hobby level. I don't really play it in bands anymore. I have in the past, but had a big stint where I didn't touch the guitar at all and was leaning heavy into keyboards. And then I kind of had a resurgence with the guitar about 10 years ago and haven't really looked back. So still play the keys some and also do some like electronic music production and stuff like that. So obviously having some proficiency with the piano helps there. My primary original project is called East Coast Dirt. I've been in that band since 2007. We're based out of Asheville, North Carolina. I started playing in that group as a keyboard player. and then did a little bit of instrument hopping. I would play a small chunk of songs maybe with guitar. We went through a lot of different lineup changes over the years, a lot of different guitar players, and after so many of those, we kind of decided to take a break. I think it was 2016 or so. And when we got back together in 2020, it was just the three of us that decided to reunite who had been constant throughout all the lineup changes. And it's like, you know what? I'll play guitar. And so we reformed as a trio, guitar, bass, and drums, and have been busy just doing that. We recorded an album ourselves. It's called Polarization. We did it in our practice space with all our own equipment, all our own software and everything like that. Cost us $0. So pretty proud of that. It's everywhere you stream music, Spotify, Apple Music, etc.
For this band for East Coast Dirt, the Reform, the trio that is now, you said you're based in the Asheville area. What are the names of some bars or venues that anyone's listening who might be in that same area might be able to catch you guys?
Oh yeah, we like to do the breweries. Mills River, which is just south of Asheville, is one we're playing in a couple months here. We play there a lot. Big Pillow Brewing is in Hot Springs. We love playing there. And then here in town, there's Asheville Music Hall, and the One Stop is an actual bar music venue that we like to play at a good bit. There's always new venues that we're trying to get into, a lot of breweries in Nashville. So if there's a brewery that has live music, chances are we're going to be trying to get in there.
All right. Well, those of you listening, keep your eyes out for East Coast Dirt when you're going for your latest drink at whatever brewery you go to in the Asheville area. But Will, you're not done just with East Coast Dirt. I understand you have a Phish project coming up. Considering that this is a Phish podcast, I think would be beneficial to bring that up as well. I think we'd be remiss not to talk about that.
Playing Phish music is something that I've kind of done off and on for a long time. I was in my first Phish tribute back in 2001. There weren't a whole lot of them back then, but I think there were maybe two or three when I was doing that. And a few years later, did it again. A few years later, did it again. Had a couple one-off gigs here and there and stuff like that. So it's something that I really enjoy. And I'm joining an existing project based out of Charlotte called Nectar, a picture of Phish. They've been around since I think 2019. And I am joining as their new guitar player, as their original guitarist has finished a graduate program and found himself a new career and a new home and has moved away. So I'm happy to fill those shoes and looking forward to continuing to play more shows of Phish music on top of my original stuff.
What about as a guitarist? What songs do you look forward to playing the most when it comes to Phish tributes?
I like complicated material. You put the work in to learn it. You want to have an opportunity to play it. So I'm excited about getting back in with some more challenging material, like Divided Sky, and I've always enjoyed playing You Enjoy Myself. Those are songs that I have to kind of stay on top of personally, rehearsal wise. So if you're putting the time in, like I said, you kind of want to make sure that that's going to good use. And then just as a like personal favorite, I always love playing Slave. If I had to play one Phish song, that would be it.
Absolutely. And we're going to hear and discuss a really great version of Slave to the Traffic Light a little bit later. Any plugs, any band names you want to remind us of? Anything you want to tell the listeners that they should keep an eye out for?
I think we covered it again. East Coast Dirt, you can find us on Spotify. Nectar, a picture of Phish, you can find us on Facebook. That band's playing out of Charlotte. East Coast Dirt plays mostly in Asheville and the surrounding areas, but we do get to the Charlotte area as well. Even just giving us a stream if you're halfway across the country, I'd appreciate it.
Well, we've heard about you as a musician. Let's hear about you strictly as a Phish fan with the attendance bias lightning round.
Attendance bias lightning round.
So you mentioned earlier that your first Phish show was December 11th, 99 at the Spectrum, a classic show, arguably the show of that December 99 tour. What do you remember from it the most?
Well, that was, I think, the first and last time that I did the old school mail order where you mail off a money order and, pick your tickets and stuff like that. So I remember that experience very well. I was in college at the time and going to the college post office and sending it off. And the kid that was working back there obviously knew what was going on that day because I wasn't the only person who was buying a money order from him. I got fifth row tickets, page side. It was unbelievable first show experience. There was a number of shows that I kind of passed up going to leading into that, and all the shoulda, coulda, wouldas paid off with that being my first, hood opener and just overall song selection. The Mike's Groove with Simple and Hydrogen in it. I love When the Circus Comes to Town, so that was a great song too. And there's a couple segues there in the second set that I don't know. I felt like I could hear them coming. I just felt very in tune with what was going on around me and with the music and everything like that. So yeah, I still listen to that show a lot, and like I still get chills hearing the crowd kind of erupt during the beginning of that hood jam and stuff like that. It instantly takes me back to that moment. So hard to top.
What was your most recent show, and what did you think of it?
The Raleigh show in 2022, July 29th. It was a good show. There was a Steam that went into Stash and then back into Steam. That was fun. First show I've been to since COVID. I think prior to that, the last show I went to was the 3-night Charleston run in 2019 December. So it had been about 3 years. Yeah, there was Ruby Waves like that, Beneath the Sea of Stars. As far as newer material, I really like that. I know some people like to hate on some of the newer material. I really enjoyed hearing Light that night. Just the overall second set was a good kind of mix of major key, blissy kind of ballad stuff, as well as just, more upfront rock and roll. And the first set was really solid with there's a horn in there too. That's another favorite song of mine. So a lot of favorites. It wasn't mind blowing or revolutionary or anything like that, but it wasn't a bad show. We had a good time, reconnected with some old friends too. So, and we stayed dry. It was looking like it was going to get kind of nasty there with some rain. I remember we stopped and bought ponchos, but didn't end up needing them. So that's always a good memory to not have to deal with that last disaster. And I still have a funny pin that I got of someone with Trey holding up a thing of Dove soap, and it says "The ocean is Dove." I get a kick out of that.
Man,
Or
Phish
the
fans,
lotion. The lotion is Dove.
Yeah.
That's what it was. Yeah.
Oh, the lotion is, for as clever as Phish fans can be, and I mean this with all respect for all our creatives, we also go for the lowest hanging fruit there is. We're great with dad jokes.
Yeah.
Well, moving away from Phish, maybe just a half step. Other than Phish, because you're a musician, what other bands have you probably seen live the most number of times?
There's a couple layers to this. Obviously, I'd say my number two would be Tab. So that's kind of, there was a period where I think I'd seen more Tab shows than Phish shows for a while there. So, but that's not really straying from what we're talking about. So non-Phish adjacent, Steve Kimmock. I've seen a lot of Steve Kimmock shows, Steve Kimmock Band, and just saw Jazz is Dead last year before. That was great to see him with Alfonso Johnson again, who used to be a mainstay in his band back in the early 2000s. Steve Kimmock, I think, is the only artist I saw at the Wetlands back in New York City. So that's, a good memory. And then Phil and Friends shows from April of 99. That was heaven for me. Two of my favorite guitar players playing together. So spent a lot of time studying those and learning licks from both of them. But on the other end of the spectrum, I love indie music and, just all sorts of stuff. And that stuff's a little bit more by the book. So you're not really, oh, I've seen this band a dozen times. But, I try to go out and support a lot of indie artists that I've heard through Spotify algorithms, or I listen to a lot of KXP, so I discover a lot of new music there too, and I always try to support touring acts that probably aren't on as many folks' radar. So I like it all.
Will, what is your most controversial Phish opinion? Something you say that someone else might go, well, actually.
I'd say my most controversial Phish opinion is that Numberline is a great song. I think it gets a bad rap from poor set list placement and, following too many rip chords for a while there, but I've always loved that song. And, I think it comes from a period where Phish was kind of getting back into it. And, if it wasn't for that song and what that started, we might not be where we are today. So
I
I'll
agree
die
with
on that
you.
hill.
You know what? That's a hill worth dying on because I agree. If not being a huge fan of the song itself, like if Numberline was written in 1995, it might not be the greatest. It might have gotten the Prince Caspian treatment that got in 1994 and 95. But just for the role that Backwards Down the Numberline played in the reformation of Phish and the comeback of Phish, it should be kind of immune a little bit to that sort of criticism and that sort of hate. In my opinion, it earned it.
Yeah.
And finally,
But
I'll go ahead.
a horrible ripcord is a horrible ripcord, and I can see why, a lot of people want to hate on it because of that experience. But from a song standpoint, I think it's a great song, and I love the major key uplifting guitar work as well. So lots of tasty licks in there.
Well, to wrap it up, Will, you've been to a bunch of shows. What is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Phish show?
This is kind of a hard question for me. I know that there were probably some, weird things in the crowd or the lot scene that I just can't put my finger on anymore. So, I mean, I guess the easy answer would be the Charlottesville naked guy in 2009. But when you think about it in terms of a Phish show, seeing naked people isn't really that weird. But that's my answer.
When was this show played?
Taking a time machine back roughly 24 years, we're going to take a look at summer of 2000, the summer 2000 tour. Phish started the summer with 7 shows in Japan with the much lauded, very well respected, and well known Fukuoka show on June 14th. And then they played 20 shows for the US summer tour. After that, they played a 22 show fall tour, which all led up to the band's first hiatus. And I did a little bit of digging back there, and I found out that this was announced in Entertainment Weekly in August. On August 4th, 2000, I remember this Entertainment Weekly issue. The writer wrote, "The members intend to take an unofficial sabbatical for an indefinite period, possibly a whole year. There's no cause for alarm. They all say they're a long way from calling it a day." And then Fishman was quoted by saying, "Every 15 years or so, we need to take a break." I remember just hearing about the hiatus at the end of September when they played a show in Las Vegas. It was their first webcast, actually.
Yeah, I remember that too. That was like
Yeah.
such a thing, like everyone's like, how's this gonna work? And oh my gosh, we can watch the show online. And I do remember them pausing at maybe it was at the encore break or something like that, where they talked about, they made the kind of official announcement that they were going to go on hiatus. I still remember being in my college dorm room and watching it on my crappy little monitor.
For the summer, the band started at the Starwood Amphitheater in Antioch, which is basically Nashville. 2 shows in Georgia, a single show at Walnut Creek. Then they started promoting Farmhouse on Letterman with Back on the Train. I remember being in my dorm room watching that.
Yep.
They moved on to 2 shows at Holmdel, 2 shows at Hartford, and then back to New Jersey for 2 shows at Camden. I believe that it's the 3rd, right? July 3rd and July 4th, today's show. They then played a series of single shows in Toronto, Burgettstown, Alpine Valley, and then they closed out with Deer Creek, Polaris, Columbus. They wrapped up the whole tour with a radio broadcast in Texas that I had no idea about until I started researching for this episode. So they were touring pretty hard. I think I could see why they needed that break.
I felt like it was a successful tour. And like you said, it was all in support of Farmhouse, which came out in May of that year. So I don't feel like their more recent tours and supportive albums kind of had the same vibe. It seemed like the material was very well received. Everyone was excited to hear it. And like it was all going interesting places with the jams, as a couple of these songs in the show highlight. I saw 3 or 4 shows on that tour. I saw one of the Atlanta shows and I saw one of the Homedale shows too. So this was my 3rd show of that 2000 summer tour.
Yeah, to your point about promoting albums, I think Phish is well past that. And I think the music industry has changed kind of past that because Phish has always played their songs before they record them to be released on an album. That's just the way they've always been. Now, with their most recent studio album, at least as of this recording, Sigma Oasis, they don't really need to tour in support of anything. They just play and people show up to see what's going to happen next.
Right. And I'm not saying that they were like touring to support it to boost record sales or Billboard charts or anything like that. I don't know. It just seemed like they were excited about the work of material and happy to play it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I certainly agree with that. And I think Trey in particular, considering that he produced Farmhouse, and I think he wrote, I could be wrong on this, but I think he wrote every song on the album. I think it was one of the few albums where there weren't any songs from other band members. So his energy was certainly there. But looking back about 24 years later, when I think of Phish in 2000, my mind tends to go to these like boomy recordings, tapes, because the internet wasn't yet quite reliable to find shows, or especially recent shows at the time. And I really couldn't find a lot of tapes that had good sound. And not only that, Phish was playing a lot of ambient sort of soundscapes with a lot of layers and a lot of effects pedals, so that two things. If number one, the drugs that were also becoming popular at the time kind of lent themselves to kind of zoning out and shoegazing a little bit. But also, if you were far back toward the back of the lawn, or if you were up top in the like the 400s of any given arena, you might lose quite a few things. Like you might not hear as much as what's being laid down on stage. So I don't know as much about 2000 as I should when it comes to music, because I would rather always, when I was collecting tapes, I would always rather get a tape from 97, 96, 95, or previously, where the quality was likelier to be better than something in 2000 where it was just high end and just kind of a big fuzz of bass. That's my
Yeah.
memory.
Yeah. And, this show, I cheated a little bit because the entire second set is available across two Live Bait releases. Live Bait 14 is the first three songs, and then Live Bait 4 has the last two songs of the second set. And so my listening and review of this was spent there to really pick up on the nuance, and comparing it to the audience recording, you do miss some of that. And that's a big part of it. When they're playing more texturally and more soundscape washy and less just fiery licks and stuff like that, you need that nuance. You need to hear those layers and textures. So I think that's a valid criticism of recordings from that period for sure.
Right. And of course, I'm not criticizing tapers. God bless tapers. If you haven't, thank a taper today. But my head always goes back to the only show that I saw in 2000, which was at Darien Lake. That was September 14th. The second set opens with a very long version of Drowned. And I was there with my brother, and it was his first, and to my knowledge, only Phish show to date. He's not really into the band. And we were all the way in the back. We weren't on the lawn, but we were in like the last row before the lawn, under the canopy. And man, he was bored out of his mind, because by the time what the band was playing on stage reached us all the way back there, it was like so much had fallen off sound wise. But when you listen to it now, when you listen to soundboard recordings from 2000 and these long extended jams, like in today's show, there is a lot to pull apart. This stands up to a lot of re-listens.
And I mean, I think that's still kind of true today in some venues. If you're in the way back of the lawn, you're missing a lot of the punch and just like the detail.
Well, Will, where were you in the summer of 2000? Like, in terms of your life, you mentioned you were in college because you went to the post office. Who were you as a music fan, and what led you to this show?
I was a junior at Lehigh University, and I was working through my summer internship at the time. I was writing for the Allentown newspaper, The Morning Call. I'm from North Carolina, but I went to college at Lehigh University, so I was in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So very close to New Jersey, very close to Philadelphia, New York. It was like an hour to an hour and a half to any of those areas. So I was very lucky to be able to just hop in the car and go to anything in that area during my time at college. So I had been to Big Cypress, and my first show was just a few weeks prior to that in '99. So I was strong in my new live show experience with Phish. So wanted to catch as many of them as I could. I'm guessing I probably mail ordered for these too, if that was still a thing for that tour. I don't know.
It was. It
Yeah,
definitely was.
yeah. I mean, I had the fancy ticket stubs, not the Ticketmaster ones. So I think that was the only way to get those back then. So yeah, was just kind of enjoying a summer up north. Like I said, I was from North Carolina. My brother was in Atlanta at the time, so I'd gone down to visit him for that Lakewood show a few weeks prior. 20, 21 years old, young and dumb, and just having my summer of love, I guess.
And you mentioned that if you had your druthers, you would have picked your first show had it not been covered already on this podcast. So what puts this one, July 4th, 2000 in Camden, in second place?
It just kind of really encapsulated the summer show vibe for me. I have a lot of memories that we'll get to in certain songs that just really encapsulated that experience, being on the lawn, but it's still being a good show and sounding good. And, the jams like tones and things like that. It really seemed to encapsulate that period in their playing and their sound and in the song selection. So it's kind of like a time capsule in that regard. Like it still stands up, other shows you've been to over the years, over the decades and all that, you can kind of look at the set list and it's just kind of like a mishmash and, it doesn't stick out as much. You might remember the epic 30-minute jam or, where things were crazy bust outs, but I don't know. This one just kind of, for me, I remember the whole experience.
Set 1.
Well, let's dig into that experience. The first set naturally kicks off with the Star Spangled Banner, it being July 4th. And then they go right into Farmhouse, which is possibly the most played song of the year 2000. I like Farmhouse. I always have. And I especially liked it when it was new because it was played at a little bit more of a brisk tempo than it is now. And maybe you could define this for me, being a musician and a guitarist. Trey uses this wah wah, but kind of like watery effect, especially toward the middle and end. And like you just mentioned, it being a time capsule, listening to this version of Farmhouse brought me back to when the song was new also.
Yeah, and you could hear the enthusiasm from the crowd when they busted into it again. Like the album had just come out, so everyone was probably playing it nonstop, and it was just it was a good song for early placement. It's kind of like the Numberline argument I had. Like it's all about placement, and I feel like a song like this really shines early in a set where they can just kind of set the tone and ease into it and feel good about playing a happy melody and yeah, I also miss that kind of watery fast wah wah pedal and Trey's getting older now and that's a lot of work on your ankles, so I can see why he doesn't do it anymore, but that's just one of the examples of kind of like the tone from the period that's really illustrated in this show, just one of those kind of signature or period specific kind of effect combinations or passages that they played a lot.
After Farmhouse is Rift, which brings about a super roar from the crowd. Trey has a little bit of difficulty through parts of the composed section, but it still holds tight together. And you could hear the excitement from the audience. Rift being an old classic, still is, obviously. If the Star Spangled Banner was kind of like a nod, like it was kind of an obvious opener, almost like a checkbox, and Farmhouse is, all right, let's just keep this going. Rift is kind of the proper opener that you would expect at even older Phish show.
Yeah, I really liked Rift, and like you said, there were a couple flubs in the kind of composed first little solo section, and they were all like at transitional periods where he's kind of moving up from one key to the next. So, I felt like in this song, and there were a couple other points throughout the set where there were flubs, but they're forgivable. They aren't total train wrecks. He keeps it on the rails, and he recovers well and finishes strong. So that's part of the Phish experience for me. I love to expect the best, but also, we're all human, and they're playing improvised music. Like, shit happens, and I don't think any of the flubs in this show were showstoppers. So it's a good example of warts and all, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure you and I have both been to shows where flubs have been showstoppers. Yes. So yeah, this does not qualify for that. And After Rift is another early favorite from the same era. It's Ice. And to me, what stood out before the song itself was on the recording. I did not listen to the soundboard recording on the live bait. I listened to the audience recording. And for all the complaints I have about the boominess of 2000 audience recordings, Mike's bass like struck fear into the heart of the audience, right? It doesn't have a well-rounded bottom, at least on the recording it doesn't, but wow, is he ever present at the beginning.
It was definitely a big boom, and Mike has a lot of interesting kind of pop-ups throughout the show where he's using something a little bit unique as far as either a tone or even some of his phrasing. So I feel like that was the first part where he was kind of like letting himself be heard and staking his claim in it. It's Ice is, in my opinion, probably one of the hardest compositions in their entire catalog. So to follow Rift that was a little bit shaky with this and to pretty much nail it, that was kind of a redemption arc, I guess, to kind of make up for that minor flub and just really deliver on all the composed stuff. And yeah, the 3 to 4 minute mark, the big composed kind of chaotic part of that song, like it was flawless. I have nothing to really complain about the execution of that one. So
I agree. Nothing to complain about. No, yeah, same. Nothing to complain about. And I'll even add on to that. I'll take your compliment and raise you one that this is the first time around 3 minutes or at 4 minutes with a point that you mentioned is the first time I noticed Fishman who really would go to dominate this show. In almost every single song, there is like an extra special fill or there's coming out of left field way that you would never think to play the drums during any given song. It's Ice was the first time he really pulls it out of left field and nails it. And even during the jam where there's this weird dissonance, Trey comes in with like this twisted, weird version of the Star Spangled Banner, which I loved before Fishman brings it back to It's Ice. So this is not a long version of It's Ice, but it encapsulates a lot in a short amount of time.
Yeah, that Star Spangled Banner is definitely a little twisted. He was using the whammy pedal on one of the more obscure harmony settings, probably like a fifth or something like that. So it's got a kind of robot dissonant sound to it. You hear this kind of rise and fall of this like pitch. It's like like almost a siren, and you hear it a lot, and a lot of people don't know what it is, but that's the rack delay he has that he uses to lay down the beds of the classic sirens like in Jabu and things like that. But also he can kind of take a segment of feedback or just a note and have that cycling through that, and then there's a modulation switch on that, and that's what creates that sweeping rise and fall of pitch. You'll hear it throughout and wonder what the heck it is. And the thing that really blows my mind about that is it's random. He's not controlling that sweep at all. It's set to a rate on the device itself. So anytime I hear them use that effectively, I'm just really blown away because it's pure chance that they're able to land, like stop it at that certain time or just make it like have the effect that it has. It's dumb luck every single time. And they obviously, know what to expect from using it, but it still is just shocking to me every time that it works out so well. And I always like to hear those happy accidents.
Yeah, me too. I mean, after that complex, contains multitudes that its ice does. They come down to something a little bit more simple with a landing pad of bouncing around the room after the first real improvisation of the set. And then they dive right back in to Stash, where I really like during the intro, right? We all know the kind of early Phish template of complex beginning, strange B section, and then they kind of drift off into improvisation. And that's what most of us, at least myself, lives for, right? The improv. But during Stash, during the very familiar melodies, the guitar melodies, Trey's adding like grace notes here and there every now and then. And it just seems so comfortable. It seems like they are here not only to play, but like they should have a couch set up on stage. I don't know if you got that same feeling, but to me, it just seemed very comfortable, relaxed, and Trey could just decide to add a couple more notes here and there and still fit it within the context of Stash.
Yeah, he was kind of like moving ahead of and then falling behind the beat with that classic like A section melody. And sometimes you hear it and it's just straight and driving and to the point, but the way that it just kind of like pulses ahead and behind the beat, it's effortless and it's really enjoyable to listen to. So yeah, you don't hear that all the time, but I do think Stash is a song that he would do that a good bit during that time. It was nice to hear that and hear it not fall apart, because when you start playing with time like that, it can fall apart. And so to make it move around the beat and feel so effortless it's a feat for sure.
Right, and that's what comes from trust, and also having 3 other band members who are all rhythm experts, right? You don't need any one person to keep the rhythm because you could kind of hand it off to someone else to do so, Fishman especially. But speaking of other members, when the jam starts, it was a little refreshing for me because Trey was leading everything in the show pretty much before this Stash, but Paige leads the beginning of the jam on piano. And then it gets repetitive at about 7.5 minutes, where they kind of do this throughout the show, where they've established an A jam, and then they switch off with a B jam, and they go back and forth. And this is the first time that at least I heard it happen at this show, around 7.5 minutes, where he could go either major and bright, minor and dark, and it straddles that line for about a minute before just becoming backwards and weird. And Fishman turns to his cowbells and cymbals, like the snare drum is almost entirely gone. Like, this vaguely resembles a rock concert at this point.
Yeah, it's definitely pretty avant-garde. And I agree that this is like the first of many moments where they're kind of seesawing between two different themes a little bit, and it's like they'll lean on one for a while and then they lean back to the other. It's got that kind of pendulum effect or whatever. It's more fluid, I guess. It just feels natural and flowing, whereas, a lot of the more modern jams we're hearing in the last 5 years or so, it's a lot more of like a gear shift, like all right, now we're in second gear and it's a big change, and then they sit on that for a while and it changes. So the fact that it's slower and kind of back and forth is unique to that time as well.
Absolutely. And the communication it must take to kind of know we're going to develop this segment, and then we're going to kind of ooze into this second segment, and now we're going to switch off back and forth between them. This happens a lot later in the second set too. It was really impressive. And Stash ends though with this amazing tension and release, just straight rock and roll that really grabbed my attention for the first time after the Star Spangled Banner tease in It's Ice. The end of Stash really took me for a ride. Before they get to Lizards, which again were very early in Phish's song Over, right? There a lot of these songs are written before like 1993 or 1994. And Lizards gets a huge reception, a warm reception. It's a crowd favorite. It's never been out of style for Lizards to be played, right? It's always a fan favorite. And then after the Lizards, they go into yet another early rarity of The Man Who Stepped Into Yesterday and Avenu Malkenu.
Right. And before we, Lizards is pretty by the book. And, like you said, the crowd response it's audible, and you can really hear the enthusiasm during the chorus. And I remember seeing the pit, hopping around during the chorus and things. Like, it was really good energy, playfulness, and they were eating it up. Page had a great piano solo, which he was very, very patient with, but when I talk about this show kind of sticking out as summer experience, like I still remember the final "If I Was a Dog" theme at the end of Lizards, and just like there being a slight breeze and the sun's starting to go down, and it's that kind of like three-quarters of the way through first set on the lawn. It's just a core memory for me of seeing Phish in the summer. So that's a great encapsulation of that with that melodic theme for sure.
And then transition to Ready Close the Set with Julius.
Yeah, Julius was a good set closer for sure. It's like kick it up a notch a little bit, but still have some kind of standard blues based rock riffs. It's not getting too weird, just bit of a barn burner. What I really liked about this is that it felt like a just gradual build throughout of the whole song. It starts with the stripped down intro, and as all the instruments kind of get a little bit louder, it's like a very steady incline as the song progresses, and then just ends, in its traditional rock fashion.
Well, I noticed that too, because as always, Julius opens with that trademark riff just being played over and over again. In this version, the crowd starts clapping along and the whole band stops playing. Like Fishman comes in and then he stops, or Gordon starts playing and then he stops for the audience to be the rest of the band. And it's really fun.
Yeah, they're making space for the audience, just like they make space for each other. And it just goes to show that they're all listening and responding. They're not just going through the motions, for sure.
Hi, everybody. Brian here to welcome you to the set break of today's episode of Attendance Bias. First, thank you for listening. And second, just a quick reminder to tell you that even though Attendance Bias comes to you for free, it does take a lot of work and it does take quite a bit of money to keep the lights on here at production. So I just wanted to ask a small favor if you could support the podcast in any number of the following ways. If you could leave a review or a rating of it on whichever podcast app you use. If you could spread the word, telling a friend or someone you think may be interested in it about it. Or probably the most concrete way is to go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate however much you can financially to help with the continuing costs of Attendance Bias. So thank you again so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the second half of today's episode.
Set 2.
The second set, when I pulled up this show to start listening, this is where the phrase of a 5-song second set kind of like moves a show into legendary status. This is a show that does it. 5-song second set with every one of them on the Phish.net jam charts, and it opens with a half-hour-long Gotta Jaboo. This is what makes you either love Phish or hate Phish.
Yeah, and for me, Gotta Jaboo was just another one of those farmhouse tunes that was new, and we were excited to hear it. This one in particular really went to some new places that you don't hear as much with Jaboo. And I feel like a lot of what he was doing is kind of similar to some of the end jam of First Tube, with just the kind of big chordal washes and just really being patient and all over that kind of rock solid grooving bass line. Mike definitely modulates tonality a little bit, and it does break minor a little bit as the jam keeps going, but it still kind of has that same accent. Mike's hitting those same accents even when he's changing the tonality of it. So yeah, just rocking that groove. And this song and First Tube and a couple other ones that were on this album, they were all originally songs that he wrote with Tony in his original trio. So Mike's was honoring that mentality of how to approach the song more so than he does now, where he just kind of puts his own flavor on it. Not saying that's a bad thing. I just, it was interesting to hear him really just stick that groove the whole time, because I know that was a big part of that material for Trey. When it was early in this early 2000 tour, they were still really, really just leaning into the grooves like that, rather than just like seeing where it takes them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes sense, right? I mean, now it's been almost a quarter of a century, so Mike should feel some ownership of it by now. I hope that he would. But like you said, it was very straightforward for about 5 minutes, but it also demonstrates not just the repetitiveness of it, but also how in the pocket they were. Right, that Mike can just play it over and over again. And this, to me, first came through in Julius to show how in the pocket they were. But this was just really laying a rhythm bed for the rest of the band, notably, obviously, Paige and Trey, to really start swirling and layering and playing and noodling and figuring out where is this going to go. By around 11 minutes, there's what I just call the 2000 guitar tone. And then it goes all of a sudden, just a minute later, to some funk. Like, it's very different than how it started. And the funk just gets more and more on top of itself, that by around 16 minutes, it's almost all just bass and drums, with crazy drum fills by Phish, by the way. This really changes. You know, that game where it's like, name the jam, where you play just like a segment of the jam and you tell me what song it came from. It's not completely distinguished from Gotta Jaboo, but it's damn close.
Yeah, what I really liked about this is, the start of the jam, it's just your typical major key kind of noodling, and it's enjoyable. I like the way Trey approaches the major key noodles. So it's enjoyable. But he takes his time, and it's like you said, around the 10 or 11-minute mark, like you hear when he finally hits that higher octave that he's just been teasing for so long. So there's a lot of patience going on, and you feel the energy when the crowd hears it, and when the band all locks into it, and that kind of triggers sort of the next start. And so, Page changes up his sound a little bit. He starts bringing in a little bit of electric piano, and that's when Trey starts to bring in more of a minor key tonality, and you can hear Mike really, he's still playing that doom, ding, doom, 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 let that same rhythm, but then he starts dropping the third down to a minor third. So he's getting minor, and then once everyone's locked into minor, that's when Page starts bringing in the clavinet, which makes it, like you said, it gets kind of funky, but still keeping that rhythmic foundation. And then around that point, the siren loop that had been playing for, the first 10 minutes, it stopped at some point in that chaos. And then he hits a chord that, like, he triggers a like backwards loop. So you hear that chord kind of swell in a slower loop. And so it opens up the jam because it doesn't have that busy siren repeating. It's got this more sparse, like that happens. And so everyone kind of hears that new space that was created by changing those loops. Then it gets really stripped down. And you talked about how it's like just cowbells and rhythms and almost just drums, and Page is leaning into some pads and just getting like textural there. And I don't know, there's a little plinky section there which I couldn't tell if that was still from the era when Trey had a little keyboard on stage too. It's hard to tell. He didn't have as many synth sounding guitar pedals as he does now, so when you hear no guitar and more than one synth sound, I tend to think that it was from that period when he had that little keyboard up there. And it doesn't lean into it long, but it's just, a nice kind of stop along the way as they kind of journey through this big jam. And, we're only like halfway through at this point.
Yeah, that's a good phrase to use, like different stops along the way. That's what it feels like. It's a half hour long, like 29 minutes and however many seconds. By around 25 minutes, really when you get toward the end of it, it sounds like it could keep going for another half hour. They don't sound tired at all. It sounds like there's much more space to explore. But Mike, at least to my ears, kind of takes over and drives it into the ground with a very smooth, I mean, you wouldn't think so because of how different the two songs sound, but a very smooth transition into I Saw It Again. It's very exciting when you realize that that's the song they're playing.
Yeah, and so like I said, they're kind of changing the jam. It's going from noodly to spacey, and then they start doing this kind of chordal wash. Again, that's a lot of what reminded me of First Tube and the style of playing they were doing there. And he even Trey's even doing some of the backwards lead stuff he does, which he also does in First Tube. But when he's really just leaning into those chords, I feel like he's painting with broad strokes. It's just this big swells and chordal tapestry rather than lots of notes. And that, like you said, it gives Mike an opportunity to kind of shift his bass line, and he starts doing that kind of descending bass line that he plays and Saw It Again. And I think we're hearing him call that song in real time. He's like, oh, look at this. It's the Saw It Again bass line.
Yep.
And you kind of like hear everyone else start to fall in line with it. And it's like, oh yeah, that's exactly that's perfect. Here we go.
It was perfect. It sounds great. I mean, I always love I Saw It Again. I'm always a fan of when they play it. I also happen to think, and I have no way of measuring this up, of course, but I happen to think that I Saw It Again, like Sparks, for example, has a pretty high batting average of when they play this song at a show, that means that show rocks. It's hard to find a show where they play I Saw It Again and it's a bad show. Maybe
Right.
That's just me. So I was really glad to see it or hear it pop up. And then at the end, at around 4.5 minutes, because the whole track is only about 6 or 7 minutes, they just kind of like quiet down. They just enter this weird, slow ambient space, almost like, oh, we've been killing it for too long. We need to chill for a little bit. This isn't a slow song, but let's make it a slow song.
Yeah, and you hear Page bring back those synth pads again, and that just kind of creates a bed of space, and there's just like some feedback and little tinkly playing, and Trey uses his whammy to go to the octave up to that kind of high pitched thing, which he did a lot. That's another kind of era specific. I mean, yeah, he still does it, but I just felt like during that time it was something that I associated with that time, that style of playing. So he's got the whammy octave up playing this really high pitched, just kind of tinkly little melodies. And there's a little bit of call and response with Page with that. And then a little bit, then Mike starts joining in with the call and response. There's a lot of that throughout the show where someone will play a phrase and you can really hear them picking up and kind of feeding back and forth on it. And that's where he starts playing the Megillah theme too.
Yeah.
Still with that affected tone. So it's a little weird. And again, it's just like, this just happened, like, oh, that was just under my fingers. And even though like it sounds weird and all that, like there's that melody and everyone just falls into it.
A lot of this show feels like that. A lot of this show makes you feel like, oh, this just happened. But of course, that's not how it works. They've been a lot of these songs are bubbling under the surface, and it only becomes obvious once a second person kind of joins in, and then you listen back. Like we were saying earlier, that a lot of this music from the summer of 2000 is so dense that it rewards repeat listens. And this segue from the end of Saw It Again to Megillah is a big treat, even if it's the 10th time you've listened to it. And speaking of treats, Megillah itself, I looked up some statistics. It's been played 71 times to date, and that's mostly in 1991. It's only been played once since July 4th, 2000, and that was at Deer Creek, July 22nd, 2003. It has not yet been played since the summer of 2003. I would go nuts. This is a real good stat flex for you to have if you ever in that conversation.
And I liked it. It was just a nice break. It kind of follows a standard jazz form and, the A and the B section and just kind of swinging and stuff like that. Very dry. And, after over 30 minutes of psychedelic freak out, like just to kind of have a little toe tapping, happy little melody, jazz standard kind of feel. It's like a palate cleanser. And, Trey still gets a little weird with some of his like comping and some of the rhythmic stabs he's doing, but it felt like they were needing to reel it back in and, hey, let's just play something normal for a second.
I agree. And you know what? I can't let an opportunity go by and not take it up to, again, point out Fishman's amazing drum fills. He just owns this song. I know that there's a space where they each take turns having their solo. Mike's is great also, but man, Fishman really took it away for me. But again, like you said, at least it's something that's understandable and comprehensible compared to the I Saw It Again and before that, the Gotta Jaboo opener that, you might need to splash your little water on your face. But Megillah, again, they're not going to stay too comprehensible for very long because we are getting into the end of the set almost with Twist, which Fishman starts with high-pitched toms and splash cymbals. It's almost as jazzy as Megillah for a while. Like, I know that Twist is a Latin jazz song, but this is a very, like, Fishified version of Latin jazz. And there are so many times throughout this jam that I think it's going to end, but it doesn't. This Twist might be my favorite jam of the night, as crazy as that might sound considering the Gotta Jaboo. It's a little bit more digestible, but it's just as weird.
Yeah, and what I really like about this jam is like all the phrasing that's happening in the beginning. That's again one of those. It felt very typical for that era. I'd kind of forgotten about it until I heard it again. Just that approach that Trey would have with the little these kind of like permeations on a rhythmic theme and just really staying in this like centered place on the fretboard and just exploring the rhythmic aspect of it and the tones that he's choosing to use. Kind of, he's adding some lower octave in there and stuff like that to give it some texture. And Phish really picks up on it, and they kind of like, then you hear some call and response with them. So it's like depending on where you are on the show, you're going to hear two of these members having a conversation and sort of morphing the jam. And I feel like this beginning of that twist jam is where Trey and Phish really kind of have that moment. After a few minutes, yeah, he does kind of like try to loop a little phrase that's kind of built around that, and he kind of abandons it. Like you hear it loop a couple times, and then it goes away, and they kind of keep going back to that rhythmic phrasing that they're doing. But after a while, he brings that loop back. So he didn't clear it; he just stopped it from playing, and then he started it playing again, and then that's when they really start shifting. He stops playing the kind of busy rhythmic lead and just kind of opens it up. And that's when I feel like they really lean into a kind of darker, more minor sound. And that's when he starts using like a mix of effects that I really like. He's using an octave down, a little bit of dirt, both probably from the amp and, a tube screamer, and then the Univibe, that kind of wet, swirly tone. It's a kind of signature tone that he used a lot that was unique. It was a combination of effects. It was kind of like a recipe, whereas I know on the episode that you just had talking about the Cincinnati show, he was kind of critiquing current Phish being like pedal soup, and a lot of those current tones, they're neat and they're cool and all that, but you're just turning on one pedal and you're getting that sound. Like this was something that he had to sit down and like, all right, I'm gonna put this, and then I'm gonna add this, and then I'm gonna add that, and like he kind of creates this new sound which he uses a lot in that time. for anyone who's kind of curious of a great example of that, that you can just dial up anytime to hear is the guitar solo in Back on the Train. That's that combination of the octave, the univibe, and a little bit of dirt. And just it's a very unique tone that I feel like is distinctively him, and it's great that, it's something that he created from a combination, not just pulling up a preset on a new modern pedal.
And I also love how you are focusing very much on the different effects pedals and the combinations that Trey is playing, where my ear almost always drifts towards Fishman, where the part that you brought up, when he brings that loop back and then they really start to cook, it's around 12 to 14 minutes. I wrote that they're in another groove that's accentuated by Fishman's China cymbals, right? That's kind of what distinguishes it for me. And the next sentence that I wrote in my notes just kind of sums it all up for me. I wrote that they're addicted to synergy. They can't play for more than 2 or 3 minutes without someone else jumping on to whoever's playing the lead. They're just addicted to synergy. They can't separate from one another. They're an organism.
It's the hey game, or the yes and at work. And yeah, that China cymbal, like Fishman really starts leaning into the offbeats, da, 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 and that they all kind of start building off of that. And Trey leads into more like chordal rhythmic work rather than the kind of just single note psychedelic lead sound. And so that kind of gives it the next shift, or stop along the way. And he starts kind of getting some like lower crunch chords and like kind of really hitting some low notes that ring out, and then he starts like sweeping in the whammy too to get that like it's like which he kind of does something similar in Perini these days. And so you can kind of hear him like playing with his effects, but like a lot more patient, and it's all about the combination of the effects he's using and also just like the phrasing. It doesn't feel like he's just like stepping on a preset. There's a lot of thought involved in it, a lot of intention.
Yeah, and they're very lucky. You're right. And they're lucky because they get to have it both ways, a lot of thought and intention, but they're still improvising, because by 15 minutes, they're doing this kind of improv A section, B section that's been developed over the past 10 minutes. Like they established this one song, for lack of a better phrase, and then the second song, and then they've already arranged how they're going to play one for 4 bars, and then they get to play the second for 4 bars, and they do that for a while before ending the song. And segueing into your favorite, the perfect landing spot of Slave to the Traffic Light, and we're already just 5 songs in, and it's the end of the set.
Yeah, and this is a different Slave, and it's in line with the rest of the set. It's a lot more textural. It's a lot more about like chordal playing and this slow build wash rather than major key noodling or a lot of single note phrasing. It's a fuller, slower, more patient sound. And from a technical standpoint, it's not tricky, you know. He's not really doing it. He's playing arpeggios. He's spelling out chords and, you know, just kind of going up in octaves and just kind of taking that whole progression up. And it's effective. And, you know, when you want to talk about the texture of it, again, you know, that you've got the kind of swirl from the Univibe, but this is really apparent in the soundboard, maybe more so than the audience recording, but you can really hear that slow Leslie on top of that. So he's kind of got like two things swirling at the same time. He's got the Univibe, which has kind of got its medium tempo pulse, and then he's got the slow Leslie, and then the Leslie, you know, it's got a tube amp in it too, so it's adding its own kind of unique grit to it, you know, its own sort of distortion to that tone. And he triggers the speed on it every now and then, so that's when you hear it get really watery and fast. But he just does it in bursts, so like it's just that kind of blend of modulation that just paints this picture for me. The peaks, like the kind of bendy peak release of this jam, you know, there's one, and then there's another, you know, at the end that kind of is like, all right, the song's almost over. They're not, I've heard better peaks, you know, like they're not terrible, but like, you know, they're not the strong part of the song, which usually you would think that's what you're listening to Slave for, is those peaks. And for me, it's more about just that kind of overall texture and painting that he does with the kind of slow chordal wash throughout the whole song. So I think the Slave is very unique in that regard. If you compared it to like the one on the live one, where it's just straight fire and he's just playing, you know, melodic phrasing and leads, like this is more textural, or like you mentioned, like kind of shoegazy.
Yeah, everything in 2000 was more textural. And yeah, and it's the real friends we made along the way were, you know, the stops along the way of each jam. That's really what it's about. And they go off, they end with Slave to the Traffic Light, and then they come back on with a really classic 1-2 encore of Lawn Boy. Of Page really takes his time walking to the front, wishes everyone a happy 4th of July. He sounds like my dad, kind of, at the end of a barbecue. And then they close with Good Times, Bad Times, with really strong rock and roll. Like you must have all walked out of there completely glowing and sweaty.
Yeah, and you know, the one thing about the Lawn Boy is like Page just, he feels so genuine with his addressing the crowd, and you know, he's hamming it up a little bit, but he's also just, you know, you can tell he's happy, and you could see them as that song ends, and you can hear it on the recording when the fireworks start going off. You can kind of see them enjoying the fireworks just as much as anyone else is. One thing about that Lawn Boy that kind of continues along with the whole call and response is like during Mike's solo, Trey kind of starts to step in, and you hear a little bit of them kind of going back and forth with some licks where, you know, sometimes Trey just doesn't get in there at all. So you know, some people be like, "Hey man, why you playing on my solo?" But like they were being friendly about it, and you know, it was tasteful. And then yeah, Good Times Bad Times was, you know, fireworks. There were literal
Literally.
fireworks
Yeah.
and musical fireworks. And what I liked about this is, you know, yeah, you've got the standard cover of the Led Zeppelin classic, you know, and they're hitting all the signature parts, but after they've kind of gone through a couple phases of the solo, then like Trey's like, all right, I got to get one more chance to be me a little bit, and you can kind of hear him leave that Jimmy Page behind and get more like himself with some of his just signature chaos and like the kind of big tension build into the flourish and release and all that to kind of wrap it up. So yeah, it was a great end to a great show. And you know, like I said before, it's not earth shattering. There's it's just a solid summer show that just reminds me of that time and reminds me of, you know, that style of playing that they did so much. And having listened to the show in its entirety again, you know, I'd kind of forgotten about a lot of those little nuances and subtleties that really made up, you know, that was a big part of me being a fan back then. And as any band does, they evolve and don't do some of that stuff as much anymore. And I'd kind of forgotten about it. So it was great to revisit.
Well, Will, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you were able to revisit it, to relive it, and to talk about it. It was a real pleasure speaking with you about not just this specific show, but I think it was a wider conversation of not only your musical expertise in terms of technical music theory and understanding, and also technology and pedals and such, but also what Phish was like in the summer of 2000. Not necessarily the scene, but the music that was emanating from the stage. And that doesn't always happen on this podcast. And so, each episode has a different focus. So thank you so much for bringing my attention, but really the attention of any listener, to kind of get a deeper understanding of what it might sound like to go see Phish about a quarter century ago. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that was a detailed, in-depth conversation with Will Little, but there were a lot of details still to be covered and a lot of facts still to be checked with today's attendance bias fact check.
Attendance bias fact check.
As far as July 2000 is concerned, I assumed that the entire first week of that month has been covered on this podcast. It turns out that I mixed up my years. It was really July 1999 that more guests chose to review. However, when it comes to July 2000, the following shows have been covered on attendance bias. Portions of July 15th at the Polaris Amphitheater with AJ Masco, June 29th, 2000 at Holmdel with Hal Hansen, July 3rd, 2000 in Camden with Skinny and JW from the Stub Me Down podcast, and July 7th at Burgettstown with Justin Bruce. Will's first choice for this podcast would have been his first show, December 11th, 1999 at the Philly Spectrum. He mentions that it has already appeared on Attendance Bias, and that episode is one of my favorites with guest Joseph Rosenberg. The weirdest thing Will has seen at a show was The Naked Guy at Charlottesville in 2009. That show was played on December 5th of that year at the John Paul Jones Arena in Charlottesville. That entire show is covered on this podcast with guest Bruce Woodall of the Corner of Gray Street podcast, which covers all things Dave Matthews Band. It's an excellent episode, and it aired on October 6, 2021. Phish announced their hiatus at the Las Vegas show on September 30th, 2000 during the narration of Fly Famous Mockingbird. For the track listing on the Farmhouse album, there were contributors such as Scott Herman and Tom Marshall for the lyrics. Also, members of Tab got some songwriting credit. But there are no songs attributed to any other band member of Phish. Farmhouse, the song, was only played 8 times in 2000. That does not put it even in the top 10. In fact, that doesn't even put it in the top 30 of songs played that year. The most played song in 2000 was First Tube, which was played 25 times. And finally, toward the end of the conversation, Will references the attendance bias episode about the Cincinnati show. That episode was with guest Kevin Hollow, who chose to review Phish's show from June 21st, 1994 at the Cincinnati Music Hall. And that's it for today's episode of Attendance Bias. I'd like to thank Will Little for joining me today. I'd like to thank Phish.net for providing all the information needed for the fact check, as well as the Mockingbird Foundation for everything they do for music education, and finally Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show. You can leave a rating and a review of it on your favorite podcast app. You can follow Attendance Bias on social media, and you could go to www.buymeacoffee.com/attendancebias and donate anything you can afford. It would be very much appreciated. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Attendance Bias.